Okay, well, I see that we are live now, and I know that people will be joining us sort of in drips and drabs for the first few minutes, and that's just fine. But I think I will go ahead and get us started here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Joyner, and I will be the moderator of this event. We are gathered here at a Stimson Center event. Um, to participate in a project sponsored by the Stimson Center and also the State Department Export Control and Related Border Security Bureau. We'll be pleased to hear today from Dr. Andrea Viski, who has written a primer on foreign direct investment screening. And so we'll hear from her in just a few minutes. Those of you who tuned in to see Dr. Scott Jones, and who wouldn't, will be disappointed because you're left with me here. Again, I'm Dan Joyner. I'm a professor of law at the University of Alabama and senior counsel at Wumble Bond Dickinson Law Firm, and I'll be serving as the moderator today. So I think what we will do first, I kind of wanted to just say a few words before we get to our speakers about this project and then sort of how I think it fits into trends in international trade law, specifically sort of strategic trade right now. Again, what Dr. Viski has written is a primer about foreign direct investment and sort of a tutorial for states who are thinking about creating, building, strengthening their own FDI screening program. And this, of course, is a very timely subject. We are, from the perspective of an international trade lawyer, this is a fascinating and dynamic time in the history of international trade law and policy, when many states seem to be moving away from reliance on the post-war multilateral trade regime with the World Trade Organization and its associated treaties at the center. We're seeing an increase in unilateral restrictions on trade in various forms: export controls, sanctions, targeted subsidies, import restrictions. These unilateral measures are being maintained for a variety of reasons, but primary among them appears to be a sense of concern about nations' economic and national security. Foreign direct investment screening is in a number of states a part of this turn to economic security-related trade restriction. In the United States, for example, in 2018, Congress passed the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, to revise and strengthen the functioning of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS. And since that time, CFIUS has been increasingly active in reviewing foreign direct investment transactions into the United States. That's just one example. But the primer that Dr. Viski has written provides information and guidance for countries that wish to build or revise their own foreign direct investment review systems. And she will talk us through the purpose of foreign direct investment screening and how to build and maintain an effective FDI screening mechanism. For some further introduction to this study and its context, I would now like to recognize and turn the floor over to my old friend, Julia Krasonsky, who is Senior Advisor for Strategy and Planning at the Office of Export Control and Cooperation, Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, U.S. Department of State. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan, and good morning to all of you, and good afternoon or evening to those of you that are joining us from other parts of the globe. On behalf of the U.S. Department of State, I want to welcome you to the launch of the FDI Screening Primer. As Dan mentioned, my name is Julia Kirsansky, and my office, Office of Export Control Cooperation at the Department of State, administers the Export Control and Border Security Program, or EXBS for short. And EXBS is the program that has supported the publication of this primer. For those of you that may not be familiar with EXBS, our mission is to work with partner countries and to help them develop legal frameworks and institutional mechanisms to prevent unregulated trade and transfer of WMD-related dual-use goods, advanced conventional weapons, and related technologies. And under the EXBS program, we accomplish this by addressing three specific pillars: strategic trade management, customs enforcement, and border security. And all three of these elements are relevant to the topic of investment screening because EXPS assistance seeks to prevent illicit transfer or exploitation of sensitive technology and to protect our partners' critical assets and border infrastructure. And as Dan mentioned, some FDI, including state-backed FDI and critical infrastructure, can have security implications, and many countries are now taking steps to address those risks. So, for example, the OECD data has shown that a sizable share of FDI in critical infrastructure is in fact carried out by state-backed entities and is frequently bundled with financing and project management that is also provided by state-backed entities. And in countries where infrastructure is poor and choices of funding are limited, some partners feel that they may have no choice or leverage when it comes to foreign investment and that they are fortunate to take what they can get. But what may appear as an attractive foreign investment today, either in critical infrastructure or in high-tech sectors, can turn out to be a net negative if that investment ultimately undermines national security. And while this may sound like a dire assessment that may lead one to think of that FDI is inherently risky venture, that's not the message that we want to convey here. What we want to convey is that FDI in most cases is a very positive and necessary component of countries' economic growth. And in fact, the United States' commitment to open investment is a cornerstone of our economic policy. It is evidenced by the fact that US is both the largest foreign investor and the largest beneficiary of foreign investment in the world. So our country has clearly benefited from both sides of this equation, and we want to make sure that other countries do as well. We know that foreign investment can create jobs, advance manufacturing and services sectors, improve the business environment and labor conditions, lead to higher incomes, and increase the overall economy of the country. And so foreign investment can often address a part of the large financing gap that emerging markets in developing economies often experience. And that's the FDI Screening Primer actually starts from this assertion that foreign direct investment forms an important component of global economic growth and competitiveness, providing long-lasting links and integration between economies and societies. This may be going contrary to what Dan just mentioned, that there is, that we're observing this move away from multilateralism and, more into sort of countries taking steps to protect themselves. I see, developments in FDI screening measures more like developments in contract law, where both parties want to understand the implications of agreements that they're entering to and protect themselves from unseen, consequences or implications of those agreements. So the goal of this publication is to provide the governments with an initial overview of how some countries mitigate national security risks associated with foreign investment, so that EXBS partners can consider similar measures while implementing their own investment screening policies in a way that does not deter beneficial foreign investment. In other words, we hope that this primer will serve both as a tool for both those countries that are in the early stages of creating their own investment screening policies, as well as for the countries that already have FDI regulation and are in a process of updating their legislation or strengthening implementation of those measures. The authors of this publication undertook this task from an academic approach, reviewing global FDI regulations and implementation practices worldwide, and sharing some observations about various practices for the benefit of the global whole. They include multiple viewpoints, engaging government agencies, legal professionals, and research experts in compiling the data in order to provide broad experience and insights. And our hope is that this primer is going to be of use to many partners who should be engaged on this topic. I very much look forward to Andrea's presentation of the primer and to the follow-on discussion with all of you. And more importantly, I am hopeful that following the publication of the primer, this document, our partner countries will share it with their governments and will use it as a tool to develop effective policies that address the types of national security risks that are most relevant to them. And with that, I want to turn this back over to Dr. Andrea Viski, and very much look forward to the conversation and the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Yes, it is now, will now be our pleasure to hear from Dr. Viski. I'll introduce her briefly. Dr. Andrea Viski has worked for many years on trade, security, and technology issues. She's published extensively in these areas, well known to all of us, and has assisted in building capacity in dozens of countries around the world to strengthen their systems to prevent illicit flows of goods and technologies. Andrea is also the founder and director of the Strategic Trade Research Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to building networks of strategic trade research and practice, and founded the Strategic Trade Review, well known to all of us in the field also, a peer-reviewed journal dedicated to trade and security. In 2015, and has since served as editor-in-chief. At Stimson, Dr. Viski is the project leader for the Trade and Investment Security Program. She also works as a senior non-resident scholar at Middlebury Center for Nonproliferation Studies. She is a CRDF Global Affiliated Expert and serves on the International Advisory Board at Coalition. So, Dr. Viski, we would be very pleased now to hear from you about your project.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for moderating this event. And Julia, thank you for your opening remarks, and to EXBS for enabling this project to take place. I'm now going to take one moment to share my screen and bring up my presentation, which hopefully everybody can see. And thank you, of course, to everybody that's joining us this morning from points all over the globe. I'm really excited to announce that the primer is actually now published on the Stimson Center website, and I will be providing a link and a QR code within the presentation. I also want to note that there is a Q&A function that you can use to write any questions that you have during the presentation or afterwards. So in terms of the structure of the following presentation, I'm first going to talk about why there was a need for this project. So why is there a need for an FDI screening primer? And in that section, I'm going to talk about some of the trends that we see, not just in terms of global foreign direct investment flows, but also measures that countries are taking in terms of screening. And I will then talk about the development of the primer and the potential beneficiary stakeholders, not just government agencies, but also the private sector and civil society, for whom this primer might be a very useful tool. I'll then talk about the primer itself, so the methodology and the research in terms of creating the findings and the findings that are produced and found in the primer. And then I'll talk about the different sections of the primer, about objectives for foreign direct investment screening, elements of foreign direct investment screening systems, and some guidelines and good practices. And finally, I will end the presentation with further steps and application of the primer. So jumping right in, as Julia mentioned, and I think is absolutely critical to underscore from the beginning, foreign direct investment is absolutely key to growth and development of countries all around the world, of our global economy. And it provides many benefits: increased employment, economic growth, human resource development, and a number of others. And in fact, before there were screening regulations or screening systems, in terms of legislation, a lot of countries had legislation in place to promote foreign direct investment and to create conditions to make the country attractive for foreign direct investment. And many countries have that kind of legislation as well, which is very important and laudable. And so that's kind of the overarching premise. In terms of just some interesting figures, that highlight the importance of foreign direct investment, from the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which provides some excellent figures and information on these global trends, we see that FDI is growing predominantly in developing economies. And in addition, we see that in terms of changes of where foreign industries, where foreign direct investment is particularly important and significant, it's in a lot of emerging tech areas like GVC intensive industries, and especially areas like semiconductors. Whereas there are actually some areas of the economy where there's less foreign direct investment over the last couple of years. And of course, a lot of the most recent figures are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which also has led to screening measures, which I will talk about in a little while. But as Julia also mentioned in her opening remarks, with FDI and all of the wonderful benefits that FDI creates, there are also some risks, and many countries have identified the need to look out for those risks and to create tools in order to address them. So one overarching concern are national security considerations that arise with foreign direct investment. So countries have been considering if there are adequate protections in place to counter risks posed by FDI, and also look at which sectors they view as particularly sensitive or vulnerable. There's also been heightened awareness, which is in line with this, over investors that are tied to or acting on behalf of certain countries that seek to accelerate their own modernization by acquiring companies and assets in sectors that may create national security concern in the country in which they're acquired, or dependencies because of that. And due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it really accelerated the awareness of countries regarding their vulnerabilities when it comes to foreign direct investment. They recognized supply chain risks and vulnerabilities, and that led to the adoption of many FDI screening measures around the world. So if you look at, again, this is supplied by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, this figure, since the last 5 years, there's been a very high growth in the number of countries that have introduced investment screening systems or expanded existing investment screening measures. And the cumulative number of countries with investment screening has gotten higher as well. And if we would look at the most recent figures if we looked at the most recent figures for this graphic, sitting here in June 2024, this would be even higher, probably significantly higher, because there have been so many countries that have actually created or strengthened their FDI screening systems just in the last year and a half. So enter the primer, and I'm going to just speak briefly here on the objectives of the document and why it was necessary or thought to be a good idea or beneficial to our community to create this project. So the objective of the primer is to provide neutral, high quality, useful information and good practices, ultimately for the purpose of positively maximizing FDI benefits while minimizing any risks posed by FDI. It's a resource for countries that are considering developing FDI screening measures, or that are looking at strengthening existing measures, or assessing the systems and frameworks that they have in place. And I see a couple of kind of target stakeholders with the primer. So the first is certainly government agencies that are looking at developing or strengthening their FDI screening measures. But also the primer can foster and be a tool that can be used in cross-agency, regional, and international cooperation and communication. And also it can be used as a tool for governments to not just consider the practices that are contained within, but to have the primer support what their own development of their secure FDI kind of long-term vision might be, their overarching policy in this regard. But in addition to governments, this can also be a tool for industry and investors. So industry and the private sector can use the primer to understand what kind of measures are subsumed under FDI screening, what kind of practices there are, how they're implemented and enforced, and also serve as a tool for compliance. And finally, civil society. So researchers like myself and others in my community have a role to play in developing best practices for FDI screening, for creating literature and content and discussion, and bridging different communities together in order to move this area forward, and also to develop a community of research and practice which can foster that ongoing discussion. And so I hope that this primer will be a welcome addition to the body of research and publications in this area. And then overall, I've put this arrow at the bottom because there is a need to increase capacity and understanding across all of the different stakeholder communities about FDI screening and its objectives, its elements, and its different practices. So I'm now going to move to the primer and discussing the methodology of the project and the research as it unfolded. So initially, I aimed to create a database of the different systems that exist around the world. And there were already a couple of similar kind of databases that I could use, but I really wanted to create fields that would be useful for the primer itself. So some of the categories that I used were, of course, the country, but also any kind of competent authorities in the country for FDI screening, or interministerial groups, the regulations, the links to the regulations, what year they were passed, how often they've been updated, or any plans to update them. And then within the regulations and implementing regulations, the objectives, definitions, sectors, specific sectors, and then any kind of information regarding sanctions and penalties and procedures, and also good practices. And then I had a lot of notes on all of those different practices that then served as kind of the basis to write the primer. In terms of the sources that I used for that database, but also the primer itself, I looked at all of the screening related regulations in different countries. I used government agency websites, which would, beyond the regulations, have forms, instructions, procedures, updates, news. I looked at international organization reports and data, such as the ones that I pulled from in the previous graphics, but several others from especially the OECD and the UN Conference on Trade and Development. I used research articles, reports, and presentations. I also undertook some interviews and presented, and in different events that I participated in, was able to enhance my own understanding of different countries' practices for screening. I also used a lot of great websites and updates from law firms. So there's many practitioners out there that are working with companies, working with investors, and working on filing different transactions. And so those were an excellent source of information as well: company press releases, regulatory filings, news, and social media, in the sense that there's some great groups on say LinkedIn that provide updates and links and news to different developments in terms of creation and strengthening of different FDI systems. But probably the most important aspect of this project, and which I especially as an editor of a peer-reviewed journal, I take very seriously, is having a form of review. And that was a very, very strong element in this project. So what that meant was that first I conducted the research, I produced a draft of the primer. And then there was a selection of reviewers that came from government agencies, that came from practitioners in the legal field, from industry, and from researchers. And all of these selected reviewers received a draft copy of the primer, to which they provided their feedback. In addition to providing the feedback on the draft, we had an in-person meeting that took place in December, where we discussed the draft and all of the suggestions and viewpoints in order to ensure that the information contained within it would be accurate and would be legitimized. And even after that review meeting, going back and incorporating the feedback, even in between the incorporation of the feedback, coming up with another final draft, there was still more input and further drafts that led to this final report. So I just want to also thank anyone that was involved in that review process, because it really was an absolutely core aspect of this project. So that leads us to the primer itself. So it just was published this morning on the Stimson Center website, and I've provided a QR code that you can point your phone to and download the document itself. And we'll also provide a link in the Q&A to the report, and also follow up with a link by email. So this is the primer, and I hope that you will share it with your own networks and whoever you think it might be useful for. So just getting to the primer itself. So the primer is divided into a number of sections. So the first is just discussing the objectives of the document and setting the stage, talking about the definition of foreign direct investment and the scope of the primer. It discusses the different types of FDI, what FDI screening is, and also there's a short paragraph on inbound versus outbound programs, and the scope of the report is inbound foreign direct investment. So the report does not discuss outbound, and I think that's just an important point to make for the actual scope of what the primer does or does not do. I then went into discussing the objectives of foreign direct investment, and it's important to provide some context here in the presentation, and that's also given in the report. So in national legislation pertaining to FDI screening, there is, or at least at the very least should be, the objectives of why the FDI screening system exists. And countries have very differing ways of expressing these objectives. So some countries, almost all of them, refer to national security. And I go through a lot of these objectives, even in the nuanced way that they're written in some of the legislation, whether it pertains to technology, sensitive personal data, real estate, or critical infrastructure. There's also other sort of categories of objectives that sometimes overlap with national security, but in terms of providing a neutral 360-degree view of why screening systems exist, I wanted to be comprehensive. And so there are other objectives that are noted, for example, public safety, public health, critical infrastructure, supply of critical inputs. Public order is an important one because the EU regulation from 2019 and the new EU proposal actually specifies public order, and that is kind of tied to the ability of citizens to be able to exercise their rights as an objective for having an FDI screening system. In some countries, the objective is freedom and pluralism of the media. So they have FDI screening that covers investments in, say, media companies, newspapers, radio stations, in order to protect that freedom of the media. There's even some countries that have implemented FDI screening over certain areas of their economy that relate to protecting their national cultural traditions. And then, in addition, there are some foreign policy related FDI screening measures that, again, countries defer in terms of which of these objectives they actually refer to. And it's quite interesting to look at all of these different kinds of objectives and the way that countries have chosen to justify their FDI screening systems. It's also important to note that some systems have kind of dedicated screening mechanisms. So, for example, in the United States, there's CFIUS, and it takes decisions and it's the body that is in charge of screening transactions, and it's made up of many different parts of the US government and led by the Department of Treasury. And other countries also sometimes have that kind of dedicated mechanism. But in a lot of countries, there are different regulations for FDI screening that actually fit under different agencies and are screening different sectors of the economy. So, for example, you might have a Ministry of Minerals and Mines, and they might have legislation that gives that authority to that ministry to screen transactions of a certain type when it comes to some transactions within that sphere. And then there might be another ministry, like the Ministry of Defense in the same country, that screens, that has separate legislation that screens FDI for completely different sectors. And they might be completely different and have really nothing to do with each other and not talk to each other. And so there are different sort of structures of systems, and there are benefits and drawbacks of sort of both of those. And so the primer does talk a little bit about that. The primer then talks about elements of FDI screening systems. So it discusses the scope, essentially the legislation that creates the FDI screening system needs to account for the scope, for conditions and thresholds, exemptions, which competent authorities are going to be involved in screening of any transactions, have a review process in place, as well as timelines for that review process, have clear information on what parties need to provide if their transaction is must be reviewed. Also, any fees or not, some countries don't have fees, a completion report, criteria for decision making, and then remedies or penalties. And then additionally, the primer discusses guidelines for FDI screening. These guidelines were important to incorporate because the OECD specifically came up with 4 guidelines for OECD members that are recommendations on guidelines for recipient country investment policies relating to national security. And I've included a section that discusses those 4 guidelines in order for that to be part of the practices and kind of good practices and best practices that are within the primer. But then what I think is one of the most important parts of the primer itself are the good practices for consideration. So essentially here, what I've aimed to do is look at different practices that countries have incorporated into their systems and kind of have them within the primer. And they might not be appropriate for every single country that's considering developing a system, or they might be. And so it's really just an amalgamation of different practices that form part of many countries' FDI screening systems. And so that includes, and of course you can read it, everything from the application of like retroactivity to having different kinds of penalties in place, to things like creating annual reports or protecting confidential information, or things like including expert input into policymaking, which is a very, very important practice in order to have an effective system. Things like technical reach back and others. So those are some of the good practices. Again, I'm not going to list all of them here. I urge you to read the report itself. And then you can get a sense of what these are. So the other point that I want to mention about these good practices for consideration is that this primer was developed at a specific point in time. And obviously, as time goes on and countries are continuing to evolve and strengthen their systems, a lot of these practices will also evolve, and there might be new practices. So I kind of urge our collective community to sort of start thinking about, you know, how this list can even be expanded, and how it can be useful, and what kind of lessons can be learned from the way that specific practices are implemented, and whether they work or not. Again, that's country specific. And, you know, just an example of this is looking at something like mitigation agreements and then the enforcement of mitigation agreements. So what kind of practices are involved in enforcing mitigation agreements? Does it involve talking to the officers that work within the company? Does it involve inspecting the company's records? What kind of practices evolve and make those and make the enforcement of mitigation agreements more effective? That is something that not countries around the world are thinking about, is how can we effectively enforce the agreements that we create? And that's one specific aspect. But if you look at sort of any of the practices, there's a learning curve, and there's an evolution, and there's a need for that kind of technical discussion to take place at some level of what works, what doesn't, and what's appropriate in what context. And so that's one of the kind of added benefits of this primer that I really hope will contribute to that information sharing process. But also, as a caveat, this does not pretend to be an absolutely exhaustive list that is going to be without time, so that it's going to remain this way forever. These practices are going to evolve, and there's going to be new practices all the time. So I just want to go back and before wrapping up, talk about some of the emerging trends in FDI screening that I've sort of observed through my research and working for the last few months on this document. So one of the trends that I've observed is that there's an expansion in the scope of sectors that are targeted by screening mechanisms to cover new activities that are considered as strategic. And not only is the scope of sectors expanding, but countries that have FDI screening mechanisms are very often updating those regulations and also the sectors that fall under them. And so that's something that I expect that we will continue to see, because a lot of the sectors, especially where it regards national security, fall in emerging technology areas like AI and quantum. And therefore, as those technologies continue to mature, and there's other emerging technologies or critical technologies that are added, we will continue to see this trend continue. There's also a broadening of definitions of investment or control that trigger FDI screening, which means that more transactions would fall under FDI screening systems, even if they were in a sector that was already under it. Also, there's been an extension of initial review timeframes, which means the discretionary period during which authorities can block investments. There's been introduction of sanctions and penalties for non-compliance with filing obligations, a strengthening of enforcement measures, or I might say with the caveat, there's more of a attention to what effective enforcement means actually in this domain, and how different kinds of systems and regulations can be effectively enforced, and what the role is for industry and the private sector in compliance when it comes to this area. Also, there's a trend for greater transparency in data. And by that, I obviously don't mean specific transactions and publishing information about them, but rather there's been more transparency in terms of countries publishing annual reports or practices in order for their own stakeholders and the wider community to have an understanding of the way that their system works and what their obligations are within that system, and to have a sense of what the government is doing. And then finally, there's attention towards FDI screening as linked to other policies and strategies. So where does FDI screening fit vis-a-vis, say, export controls or any kind of scrutiny on technology transfers and research security as part of a broader framework and strategy at the national level? And so many countries and also the European Union has been looking at that particular aspect and trying to draw links between FDI screening and other tools as part of a more informed strategy moving forwards. So just to conclude, the point that I wanted to underline from the very beginning is that just like in export controls, we talk about the need to balance trade and security. There's a need to balance the risks posed by FDI screening, by foreign direct investment, with the amazing benefits that foreign direct investment has, and its absolutely crucial role in the economies and societies of the international community. But there are gaps that remain in many countries regarding covering FDI security risks. Not only are there gaps that exist within countries, but there are still a very large number of countries that do not have a screening system at all. And so for those countries that don't have a screening system but are considering the benefits of having one. This primer is a tool that they can use to look at, okay, what would be the elements that we would need to look at? What would be the potential objectives of the system? And what would be some of the good practices that would make sense for us to implement in our jurisdiction in order to reach our national security objectives? And in addition to being a useful tool for government, I hope that the primer will also be useful for the private sector and for civil society for the reasons that I expressed earlier in terms of enhancing compliance, enhancing enforcement, and also starting to build more of a community of research and practice in terms of what these systems look like and how they can be enhanced. And so I will just kind of conclude on the note that the primer is one resource. There's other resources that will hopefully come to fruition in the future. And I look forward to continuing the discussion and to receiving feedback on the primer, and also to hoping for very, very effective policies in this area, but also the great benefits that FDI has for countries around the world. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for your participation in this event, and I will turn the floor back to Dan, who will be fielding a few questions about the primer to me, and also questions from the from those here who are participating.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrea. That was really interesting and thought-provoking. As I was, yeah, maybe you and I can have a discussion for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to general Q&A. I was thinking as you were talking, and this is me as a trade lawyer, I think about the history of reviewing investment for security reasons or others. This is something that's of long standing. I mean, countries have always, I'm thinking about in their bilateral investment treaties or regional investment treaties, where the treaty itself will provide obligations on states to generally allow entry and establishment of foreign investment, subject to like generalized most favored nation rule, national treatment rule, and all that stuff. But if you look at these bilateral investment treaties, there's always been, in almost all of them, there's a provision at the end of the treaty saying, but by the way, we reserve the right to review inbound investment for security reasons. And sometimes it'll say, and in fact, inbound foreign investment, even from our treaty partners, will not be allowed in the following areas. And then it will list certain areas, and the treaties are different. So the idea of screening for the compliance of foreign investment with national security or other policies is an old tool that countries have used. I guess, so I have a couple of questions off of that. What do you think makes FDI screening kind of a renewed focus, or something that states should have a renewed focus on? Let me ask that first. Again, it's not an old idea. Countries have been doing it for a long time. And in fact, it's written into their investment treaties. Do you think, let me put it that way, do you think there is sort of a renewed need for focus on inbound investment screening?
Okay, Dan, so if I understand your question correctly, you're asking, is there a renewed need for FDI screening?
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for the question. I hope that in the presentation, I covered that at least a little bit in terms of talking about why not only there is a renewed need, but also what we've seen demonstrated by countries that have in fact established or strengthened their FDI screening. So in particular, where an area where we've seen the expansion of transactions that are covered is pertaining to potential national security risks. And that's why I brought up the issue of emerging and sensitive technologies, but also critical infrastructure and other areas of the economy. And so those are, there's a greater sort of awareness of the security risks that are posed by FDI in those areas. And that corresponds with what we've seen in terms of a greater number of countries that have strengthened existing systems to cover those kinds of national security, potentially national security related sectors, and to screen those investments if necessary and review them. And where, yeah, and in other areas as well.
Yeah, that's sort of how I see it, meaning that investment screening is something that states have always done. But what changes over time is sort of the focus, what they're looking for. What are the things about certain investments, foreign investments, that make states nervous? And, you know, it can be that they're most concerned about, and this goes back to what you were talking about, there can be different purposes for an investment screening regime. Sometimes it's foreign policy related. I remember a case years back of the United States not allowing a foreign country to take take an ownership interest in a port facility in the Northeast. I don't remember the specific, but it can be like a physical something like that. But it can also be a concern about foreign investment then being a channel for information gathering. You know, just depending on what the state is concerned about. So it seems to me that what you said is what I tend to hear too from you know, talking with people in the fields, that the idea of investment screening hasn't changed, but the focus of states, what they're looking for, what they're concerned about, changes over time with technology, and the concerns about, like you were saying, emerging technologies and the sort of comparative advantage or competitive advantage that states have. So what they're looking for and why is what changes over time. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one thing that is described in the primer is why FDI can pose a security risk when it comes to technology transfer, right? So in terms of foreign direct investment, if there is investment in a company, and in some cases that means that there is a transfer also of the IP, of data, of any sensitive information, then that can pose a potential security risk. And in certain cases, the government might want to be aware of and ensure that the transaction does not create a security risk because of the way that the transaction takes place. And if you look at some of the mitigation agreements and the kind of elements of mitigation agreements, often they will say that, okay, the transaction can go ahead, but the kind of investor is not allowed access to certain kinds of information. Or in the audit, there's a inspection or an audit to ensure that that's actually taking place and that the IT systems are in place to create those kinds of protections. That's like a very, very specific example. But, you know, on a technical level, those are some of the elements that we're looking at and thinking about here in terms of how actually the risk can occur and manifest.
Yeah, I would like to say, I think you bring up a good point here, and sometimes people don't understand this, that FDI screening doesn't necessarily have to result in red light, green light. it can be yellow light, meaning that yes, the investment can go ahead, but here are the conditions, and we're going to sign a mitigation agreement with you. Yes, you can totally go ahead and take that ownership stake. Yes, you can invest in that telecoms company. It's just we're going to condition it on a few things. So that's important, I think, for people to take from the report. Yeah, so let's, if you don't mind, talk about the relationship between FDI screening and other forms of strategic trade control. For those who don't know, when we talk about strategic trade control, we're usually talking about regulations on export, transit, transshipment, re-export, but also import of, could be goods, could be technologies, can be investment. How would you say that foreign direct investment screening relates to other forms of strategic trade control?
Sure, I quite like that question, so thank you for asking it.
I thought Julia might too.
So this is a really important point because in some countries there has been a direct link that's been made between foreign direct investment screening and export controls at some level. Or, for example, in looking at, say, the EU strategy documents that have come out, also establishing a link between enhancing foreign direct investment screening mechanisms and also at the same time enhancing export controls and creating greater harmonization on those different areas between different EU member states. And in terms of looking at kind of the concept of strategic trade, and by the way, it's very difficult to give a definition of strategic trade that everybody agrees with because it's such a fast evolving area, and this is just one kind of example of that. So when we look at, say, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, and how 1540 in paragraph 3D discussed the need for countries to establish and enforce controls over exports, transshipments, financing of goods, materials, and technology that could be used by non-state actors and a weapon of mass destruction, but they didn't consider any of the risks posed by foreign direct investment. And so it's just kind of been an evolution in terms of thinking of, well, how do flows take place and what kind of gaps and vulnerabilities are there that could lead to the acquisition of, say, of sort of security sensitive technology or goods by malevolent actors. And so it's interesting to see the way that FDI has, that's just one example of like how FDI has sort of entered that larger discussion. But obviously, that's just one specific area. In terms of kind of more technical on the ground, like links between them in the US, we saw the passage in 2018 of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Management Act. And that sort of directly was tied to the Export Control Reform Act, in that ECRA identified the need to incorporate critical emerging and foundational technologies and to identify those as potentially those that need to be export controlled, and these were in these critical technology areas. And then soon after the passage of FIRMA, a lot of the transactions that were covered in terms of the scope of what would need to be of where companies would need to file were tied to that list, right, of critical technologies, and whether that company or that industry would require a license if that good or that technology was going to be exported. And so there's been that kind of recognition that the same kinds of technologies that are dual use goods and technologies that we might consider as having, great civilian purposes, but also potential military or national security related implications, we want to consider those as also something that a foreign direct investment screening system may want to acknowledge and screen as well. And again, that's an example from the US, and there's countries in which these are two separate areas and they're not linked at all. But that's just sort of one example of a linkage that has taken place in one country. And increasingly, like I mentioned, there is more of a recognition of needing like a bird's eye view, overall comprehensive strategy to manage the risks that are brought by trade and investment. Everybody wants trade and investment, and they're wonderful things, but the need to manage these flows and ensure that they do not create a risk for national security.
Well, since we're talking about this link between FDI screening and other forms of strategic trade control, oh, sorry, Julie, did you want to jump in here? Yeah, please.
Sorry, just to add to what Andrea was saying, I think she sort of framed it really well. I believe that the FDI is complementary to strategic trade controls or export controls. They're not mutually exclusive, and in fact, I think it's a recognition that as technology evolves, it evolves in ways in which it can be transferred through means that are not necessarily governed by export control regulations. And so you can acquire technology or transfer technology through mergers and acquisitions, where you get a controlling stake in the company. I think we've already described that example. That kind of transfer may not be necessarily encompassed within the strategic trade control legislation, and so you just relying on export control regulations in country wouldn't give you the full scope of legal means to govern those sorts of transactions. I would also say, unlike export control transactions, foreign direct investment transactions are, especially if you're investing in infrastructure, they may take, decades to mature. So you're really looking for something rather than a, sort of a singular, point in time. You want to protect yourself for the foreseeable future. So something that may not yet represent a risk to you today, or you may not see it as a risk today, if you're giving up a controlling stake in something, 99 years from now, that may represent a greater risk and therefore be, subject to greater scrutiny. And I think as we see greater trade integration, over the last, 50 to 80 years, we're also observing greater diversification of suppliers. And so areas of economy that may have been subject to exclusive state governance. I'm thinking of, space programs, right? We're increasingly seeing private sector entities moving into it and, in fact, acquiring roles and responsibilities of entities previously, belonging strictly to states, right? So you have a, potential for investment from foreign entities into domains that have been previously exclusively governed and seen as central to national security. And so you want to create mechanisms that would give you, sort of greater ability and insight into what kinds of risks that would represent. So over.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, I was gonna follow up, and this actually builds on a question in the Q&A from Azmatullah Juneho, if I'm not butchering that. But I wanted to say, we're talking about the sort of relationship between FDI screening and other forms of strategic trade control. And anyone who works in STC area knows that when you're talking to a country, particularly a developing country, or a country with smaller economy, about implementing strategic trade controls, one of the first things you hear, and it's totally reasonable, is, we don't do a lot of strategic trade controlled exports, transits, transshipments. Why would we invest the resources to build up an export control program when we don't do a lot of that anyway, and we are concerned that having that additional regulatory step is going to be a burden on our exporters. So in this context, similarly, I can well imagine developing countries saying, yes, Dr. Viski, we think you're right, that it's sometimes there can be security risks coming from inbound foreign investment, but it's a big deal to set up a foreign direct investment screening system. It's a big regulatory expense, and we're concerned about if we have to review every foreign direct investment that comes in, are we going to place a regulatory burden on this investment and scare it away? What would you say to that, Dr. Viski?
Well, first of all, I think it's an excellent question, and I really appreciate you asking it, but also to Mr. Junejo, who asked it in the Q&A. And I just want to echo that, yes, that's a really common and valid concern, just like you mentioned, for countries that were trying to develop their export control systems or pass export control legislation. It's a difficult, time-intensive, human resource-intensive endeavor, and involves a lot of different aspects. And similarly, in this area, you require like technical expertise and legal expertise and resources in terms of people's time and identifying competent authorities that are going to be doing the screening, training them, ensuring that the rules are public and that people know that they have to comply, and how to go about that. In fact, all of the different practices and elements of the primer require some form of effort, some time, some kind of resource. But I think sort of where we might kind of give I don't want to say it's a clear answer, but is that in the countries that have FDI screening systems, ultimately, those screening systems help them attract good quality foreign direct investment that protects and upholds their national security in the short, medium, and long term. And so there's not really a price tag that you can put on it. In fact, it's something that might actually be creating, good quality investments that don't create dependencies, that don't create national security or other kind of risks. And if you look at it from that point of view, it's a pretty small investment with a pretty large reward. And I hope that the primer is one resource that countries can lean on in terms of knowing where to start, in terms of understanding the elements that they might need to have. One thing that I forgot to mention in my presentation is that the primer actually contains a lot of examples. So when it comes to some of the elements, when it comes to some of the practices, I've included examples from different countries and the way that they implement those elements or those practices. And I think that can be something that instead of having to start from scratch and relying on expensive consultants, which maybe ultimately I don't know, but that the primer serves that sort of first step of creating a toolbox that countries can say, okay, this is helpful. This is something that we can use in our system, or this is something that we don't currently have in our system that we think would be beneficial to enhancing our system. So that's the way that I would sort of advise countries to look at this issue. Certainly, FDI is not going away. I mean, all countries kind of need FDI and depend on it for their growth and for their societies. And so it's only smart policy to ensure that any kind of risks are mitigated through an effective screening system.
Of course, not all consultants are expensive. Not all trade lawyers are expensive. But anyway, Julia, I thought I think you want to jump in here.
This is not a paid advertisement, right?
Not paid.
Right. So I guess, kind of building off on of what Andrea just said, it's the old adage about strong fences making good neighbors, right? You want to make sure that you're not taken advantage of in any relationship. And I take your point that some countries may have smaller economies and therefore feel like they don't want to take on that bureaucratic burden. But as countries think about how to take advantage of FDI, they ought to be thinking sort of in line with that foreign direct investment strategy. They ought to be thinking, are there areas of economies that we consider so central to our national security that we want to sequester them? Or how do we mitigate risks to those sectors in a way that allows us to not be exploited, or prevents us from being exploited? So that's one point, right? And we're offering this primer as one of the elements of the toolkit, and it's a free resource to everybody who wants it, because we recognize that there is a significant bureaucratic burden, and our program and our director has just joined, and hopefully she will validate what I'm saying. We are prepared to, or recognizing that these risks exist and that many countries are struggling with that. We are, prepared to continue to push out these sorts of, public good resources into the environment to make sure that countries have some tools that they can lean on in order to make these judgments. But ultimately, I think you're right. It relies on countries making their own risk assessments about what it is that they, what kind of investment they want, in which sectors of the economy they want to attract it, and how do they want to, what risks do they think exist, and we're there to provide that education. We're not arguing for the adoption of the system or for an adoption of any particular system. The United States has a very complicated regime, and it is concordant with our status as the greatest investor in foreign countries, and as the country that obtains or receives the greatest investment from the rest of the world. So we have to have a complicated regime, but maybe it doesn't need to be replicated in other countries, and they will have to develop something that is very specific and bespoke to their economies, and we're just there to kind of help usher that along if that's desirable. Over.
That certainly accords with what my experience in working with EXBS, for example, in developing countries. We often say it's not a one size fits all model. When we hear those concerns, they're very, very valid concerns. Often what you can do then, and this is what you're both saying, is to pick out the elements that are right for your country and that will not impose a huge bureaucratic burden, and that will not impose a huge burden on investors, but that are guided by your own knowledge of what sectors you're the most sensitive about foreign investment, and just targeting those. So it can be an a la carte menu instead of a one size fits all model. Yes. Well, sorry, Andrea, did you want? No.
Yeah,
Well,
I would, I think it's important to reiterate your very last point there. And I really hope that the primer is very clear from the beginning that it's a neutral document. And it does not say that there's any one model that needs to be adopted. In fact, in looking and doing the research of the different countries' systems, it is abundantly clear that there is just very there's not much that can be said in terms of any two systems being the same, because countries have different national security priorities, different other priorities, and so those are kind of become reflected in their systems that they create. I think that a really interesting example here is again, the reference to the EU regulation. So unlike export controls, where the regulation in the European Union is directly applicable to all of the member states, the EU regulation currently is not. And so there are some countries still within the EU that don't have screening systems. There's proposed legislation to make all countries have some kind of minimum screening system. But if you look at at the EU level, all of the different systems of the different EU member states are different. Their legislation is different. Their objectives are even sometimes written differently. And while the EU regulation talks about the objectives being national security and public order, other in the national legislation of many EU member states, it can be that, but it can even be others as well that are noted. So, and also in terms of the practices, there's just a really wide variation in terms of the practices that are adopted. So, whether it's looking at the sectors that are the ones that countries want to screen, or whether it's the practices themselves of how they conduct the screening, there's a very wide variety, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. I really doubt that there ever will be, and that's not a bad thing. And that's why the primer can be a useful tool in explaining what the different practices are, and then giving countries kind of the freedom to adopt what they think might make sense in their particular context.
Okay. Well, let's take a couple of questions from the chat. I see one from Edward Levine, board member, Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. Thanks for putting that institutional affiliation. Who asks, are we entering an era in which many more aspects of our economy will be seen as warranting FDI controls? For example, does the emerging bioeconomy lead one to control FDI in much of the medical field? Over to you, Dr. Viski.
Yes. So like, as I noted in the trends, I think that that's sort of clearly where we are heading, not all countries and not at the same pace. But in terms of looking at these kinds of potentially dual use industries and technologies, and critical technologies, that's one of the areas where we are seeing the increased purview of screening. So whether it's, I gave the example of quantum or AI, but also certainly medically related areas and biotech. That was in part brought about by the vulnerabilities that were recognized during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that are sort of since then been recognized as potentially sensitive areas where screening would be warranted.
Juliet, please.
Yes, and good morning, Ed. Really good to see you here, and thank you for the question. I would agree, and I think that sort of expands beyond just the pandemic vulnerabilities. I think much of our emerging technologies in the medical profession also pertain to data about the citizens, right? Like we're looking at maybe genetic screening or information where investments in medical fields can potentially make data related to the citizens of your country vulnerable to exploitation. And so, yes, I think looking forward, we will probably be subjecting some of these fields to regulation. And, I'm speaking as a person working for a capacity building program as opposed to a regulatory agency. So I want to make it clear that we're not addressing issues that are fully within the purview of the Department of the Treasury, but just sort of thinking about which sectors of the economy are becoming more subject to regulation, not only from the FDI perspective, but also from the emerging tech and export control considerations as well. I do think that bioeconomy would be in that sphere. Over.
Okay. Let's take maybe one more question. I see a question from Andreas Kuhn, Observer Research Foundation America. And actually, he asked something that I was thinking of too. So that's a couple of birds. He says, thank you for the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the two questions. Okay, one, how and to what degree does the U.S. State Department reach out and coordinate with other countries on investment screening, including sharing of transaction-related information and best practices? Is such sharing well-established, nascent, or non-existing? And in the future, do you see new institutions for FDI screening developing among like-minded countries, say Wassenaar, for FDI screening? If so, how might that look? Those are interesting questions. let me let you take a crack at those, Andrea.
So I think that the first one is not really within my it's I think that's probably a question that's better for Julia to answer. But if we have time. But in terms of the second one, I think that that's really interesting question in terms of looking at what kind of multilateral structures could sort of play a role of coordinating or harmonizing FDI policies of different countries. And it's something that, frankly, I haven't really thought about or considered that much yet because kind of for the exact reason that there's so much variation between countries in terms of their own screening systems and their objectives and sort of how they go about it. I see more of a role that kind of relates to the first question, which is information sharing and coordination between countries. And sort of one exception is, again, the EU model, in which there is within the EU a way for countries to notify each other of concerns regarding specific transactions, as well as to get the European Commission's opinion on certain transactions. And so that's kind of the first model that I've seen of multilateral coordination. This is on a regional level between different countries that are trying to share information that could be useful for the effective implementation of their own systems, and then also trying to create some kind of like minimum standard, which is in the proposed regulation of establishing FDI screening in certain sectors and for certain objectives. And again, that's in a proposal phase, so it's not yet adopted, but that's kind of the first model that I've seen. But then in terms of these bilateral or multilateral coordination activities, I'm not in a position to talk about that question.
Well, I will venture an answer. I don't know if any of our EB colleagues are on the line, and if they are, I would invite them to jump in and add to anything I'm saying. So within the State Department, there are many bureaus and offices that have equities related to foreign direct investment. And incidentally, again, I represent the Office of Export Control Cooperation, which administers the EXBS program. So we're outside of the regulatory process flow related to FDI. We're strictly here as a capacity building program. But from the regulatory side, the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the Department of State is the State Department's representative to CFIUS, which is this interagency review committee that Andrea mentioned at the outset of her remarks, which is chaired by the Department of Treasury. And so Treasury and EB do conduct diplomatic outreach related to foreign direct investment to countries that they identify as strategic allies and partners of the United States, and those that are, I guess, desiring that kind of information from the United States. I will say that information does not pertain to transactions because confidentiality of transactions is the cornerstone of the CFIUS regime. And in fact, one of the recommendations Andrea is making in her primer, because you want to make sure that your investors feel that they're protected and that the information that they provide to you, the government, for review is not going to be shared broadly and will be held confidentially, because it can impact, the ultimate business bottom line. So confidentiality is critical. That information is not shared with other governments, but there are other best practices that are provided to other governments, much in line with what we're trying to do with this primer. So, and we work in very close coordination with our colleagues in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, making sure that we, because they have the policy directive on the FDI related issues, that we are very closely aligned in our capacity building programs with the policy direction that they set. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, well, I think it's a really cool idea. We should develop a fifth strategic trade control multilateral regime for foreign direct investment screening. So I'll wait for the RFP from state for that. Okay, we're
Don't hold your breath.
don't hold your breath. All right, well, we're very privileged to be joined by Aista Ray, who is the director of the Office of Export Control Cooperation, Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, U.S. Department of State, and she will now deliver our closing remarks. Over to you, Ms. Ray.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. And I am very sorry that I did not get to join earlier this morning, because this conversation that I caught for the last 10 minutes sounds really interesting and important as well. So first of all, I want to thank Andrea and her team at the Stimson Center for the thoughtful research and the work that they put into creating this publication, as well as the team here at EXBS and ECC who helped shepherd the process. I also want to thank all of you who joined us for this official launch, especially those who had to stay up late or got up really early this morning. As the United States works with our allies and partners as they implement or strengthen their foreign direct investment screening practices, we recognize that each and every one of us is in a different phase of that process. Our intent with this FDI Screening Primer is to provide our partners with the tools and frameworks needed so that they can better match their foreign investment screening measures to their specific national security risks, and acknowledging that international security environments evolve and that investments may take years or decades in some cases to fully mature. We also see value in building an FDI regime that upholds an open investment climate while also addressing your nation's evolving national security risks. This is why transparency and predictability are key components of the FDI screening measures identified in the primer. It is also important to ensure that laws are codified and made available to the public, that evaluation criteria used in the reviews are also public, and that interested parties are notified about the plans to change investment policies and that their views are sought out ahead of such modifications. As my colleague Julia noted in her opening remarks, the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation is specifically dedicated to preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, their delivery systems, and advanced conventional weapons. A central part of this mandate is the work we do to help partners responsibly regulate exports of goods and technologies that could facilitate the development of WMD and also disrupting accumulations of conventional arms. Dual-use goods and technologies are critical to economic prosperity and growth. We undertake this efforts in close cooperation and coordination with our friends and allies, such as all of you, to create and enforce regulations that prevent illicit procurement and exploitation of sensitive technologies while not inhibiting the investments that make economies prosper. Maintaining healthy, open economies that leverage technological innovation and trade while protecting our national security interests requires a number of complementary safeguards, including export controls, transparent public procurement processes, and investment screening measures. We hope that this publication can offer an introduction to some concepts and considerations when designing investment screening regulations. And on a final note, it is clear from the research in this publication that the development of comprehensive investment screening measures is relatively new. This is to say that we're all struggling with these issues, and our partners should be proud for taking the initiative to tackle them proactively. These challenges are cross-border in nature, and only by collaborating with our international partners can we expect to overcome them successfully. The word cooperation is embedded in the name of the office that I lead, and my team and I look forward to using this primer as a starting point for our partnership on this topic. And for further conversations with our government, specifically on investment screening, we would be pleased to put you in touch with the relevant officials responsible for the U.S. investment screening systems. CFIUs chaired by the Department of the Treasury, as well as our colleagues in the Economic and Business Affairs Bureau at State that Julia mentioned just a few moments ago. So thank you all so very much. It is a pleasure to join you this morning for DC, and I look forward to working with you all.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Ray. Well, with that, I think we're going to bring our session to a close. Thank you for all to all those who participated. Thank you to all those who joined us, and thank you particularly to Dr. Viski for writing the primer and for giving her presentation today. We'll go ahead and close the session now. Best wishes to all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day or evening.